Hello everyone, and welcome to the Complete Python Programming course. In this video, we'll talk about sets and tuples. This video is part of the beginner tutorial. Tuples are similar to lists, with the exception of not being able to change them after they are created. Let's create a list. L equals a list of names: James, David, Lisa, and to add an item to my list, I use append and Carol. Let's print our list. Print L. Python 3, main.py, and Python printed my list with the 4 values. Python has another function. It's the type function. You can ask Python about the type of an object. The list is an object. We'll talk about objects in some later videos, but for now, you can ask Python what's the type of an object. Let's print that. Save our code and print. And Python returned that the object type is list. Let's see how we can use that with tuples. Tuples are very similar to lists, but they cannot be altered after creation. We'll talk about 2 ways of creating a tuple. The first way is T1, my tuple, and using empty parentheses. Let's ask Python. Let's first print T1, and then let's ask Python what's the type of T1. Let's run our code. And notice that Python returned empty parentheses, and after that the type is tuple. Tuple can be created using the parentheses, but as it cannot be altered after a creation, this will be useless. To add values to our tuple, we add them here: James, David, and Lisa. Let's print that now. And notice that we have our 3 values surrounded with parentheses. Let me print only the 3 values from here and just print the list and tuple, print L, and let's print T. Notice that both of them look exactly the same, with the exception that this list is surrounded with brackets while the tuple is surrounded with parentheses. If you try to add values to your tuple, add append, just like list, Carol, and Python will tell you that you cannot do that because tuple has no function allowing you to add to it. Another way to create tuple is T2 equals, let's remove this for now, and you can separate your values with a comma. James, David, and Lisa. Let's try to print T2, and let's also print T1, print T1 just to see the differences. T1. Let's run our code. And notice that T1 and T2 are exactly the same. They are both tuples. I created them using 2 different methods. Let's create another tuple, T3. This tuple will have only 1 value, and that will be James. Print T3. Let's run that. And notice that T1 is a tuple. T2 is a tuple. T3, it just printed the word James to my screen. Let's print the type of T3. Type T3. On our code, and Python said that the type of T3 is a string. In this case, Python is trying to figure out what you are trying to do, but the parentheses are used for multiple purposes. To tell Python that you are adding a tuple, you need to add a comma after your value. Adding the comma here instructs Python to create this value as a tuple. Let's print that. And notice that T3 is now a tuple. The exact same thing happens if you are trying to do that. Notice that T3 looks like a string, but if you add a comma after it, it will become a tuple. Now that's simple enough. The parentheses can be a bit confusing in this, but you get used to them, just knowing that you add a comma to create a tuple. Now let's see how we can access our tuples. I'll leave these. Let's remove the print statements. Notice that to access a list value, a value in a list, we use its index, 0. And that will return James, 1 will return David, and let's print that to confirm, and that returned David. You can do the exact same thing, print T1 and 1. And also for T2, let's print T2 here and the value 1. Let's see how that goes. And notice that all of them return David. Tuple, like lists, have indices. And these indices are created by Python and they are available to you. 0, 1, 2, the same exact thing goes for the first list and for the first tuple. And for the other tuple is exactly the same thing. Tuples are sequences. You can also loop them. For T1, for name in T1, print name. Let's run that and it functions exactly as expected. You can also get the values of these the same way you did for the list. Enumerate T1, and now you will have two values, which is index and a name, and you can print that to your screen, I and name. Let's run that. And we have 0, 1, and 2 with the value for each item. Now let's see something new. Notice that when I enumerated a list, we saw that before, and now I'm enumerating and a tuple, I can get two values from that. Let's change this to one value. Let's call it entry instead of 2, and let's print entry. Print entry. Let's run that. And notice that Python for each one returned actually a tuple. When you enumerate, you actually return a tuple in each iteration, and then after that you are accessing these values. So you can do this and access the values as entry 0 and entry 1. So enumerating a tuple will return a tuple for each index value pair in that same tuple. A little funny, but that's how it works. Let's run that again and see how that looks like. And we run our code. Let's save our program and run our code, and that will return the exact same thing, except now I am printing them as an index and a value. One more thing I would like to mention here, it's not related to tuples. If we have a dictionary, let's create a dictionary, we call it names, and let's put in it James and Doe and Mark. Now let's make it much easier. Let's do this James and let's put a number in there like 45 and Mark is 35. That's a dictionary as we saw in the previous video, and let's loop that for entry in names items. I would like just to print entry. Let's run that. And notice that running entry, we're starting from here, returned also a tuple. In the previous examples, we saw that we used to use item here and use two values here. Instead, here, when we run entry, it returned one entry, which is a tuple. And to access it, we can go with 0 and 1, the same as a tuple and a list. We will see many examples of that in future lessons. For now, let's stay with the tuples. You might wonder, why do you need tuples? Well, this is when you need to create variables that don't change, or you need a collection type like a sequence, but you don't want the variable to change. We will see that in future examples, and you will see that they can come handy in some situations. Another data type I would like to talk about today is the sets. Sets are unordered collections of unique values. A set is declared using braces or curly brackets, and it looks like a dictionary, but there is one difference. Let's say a dictionary for now. D, let's call it D. It's a dictionary, and you can add James and 45. Let's get back to that, and Mark 35. A dictionary has a key and a value. If you create your dictionary, let's say James and Mark, notice that I have braces, and inside it I have only values. Now let's print type D, and let's print type S. Let's see what Python says about that. Clear. And we run our program, and it says that this is a dictionary and this is a set. A set is an unordered list of unique values. We'll say objects, but for now we will stay with the word values because we are in the beginner tutorials. Let's add a few more items to our set. Let's add Mary, Karen, Lisa, Richard, and that's enough. That's my set, and let me print my set and see how it looks like on the screen. We didn't do that. And print my set, and it shows the set on my screen. You can add items to your set using s.add and the item you want to add. Let's try Thomas in here, and let's print our set after adding Thomas. And notice that Thomas was added to my list. But notice also that it was added just after Richard. Let me run my code again. Notice that Thomas in this case was added at the beginning, and Lisa, which was just before the last one, is now at the second index. This is because sets are unordered. You cannot depend on the order of the lists. Let's see something a little bit different. Let's print S here, and let's change Thomas to Mark. Notice that I have Mark in my set, and I'm adding Mark again to my set. Let's print that. And notice that this is my set before adding Mark, and this is my set after adding Mark. No change whatsoever. The items in a set should be unique, and I already have Mark in my set, so trying to add it again, Python will do nothing. Python will search my set, it will find that there is a Mark, it will do nothing, and it will just return the set. And you can do it as many times as you want, and you will not get Mark in your set. One more interesting thing about sets is that you can remove items from them. Let's try to remove item from our set, and when you remove an item, Python will return it to you. So item equals s pop. It has a pop function, just like a list. Let's print item. Now let's run this code and see what happens. Let's create a terminal and run this like this. Notice that it returned I printed my list for a reference: Richard, Lisa, Mary, James, Karen, and Mark. Now I used pop to remove an item, and notice that it returned Richard. Let me run that code again. Now it returned James. It removed James from my list. Let's do that again. And it returned Mary. So the item you will get at pop is arbitrary. You cannot pop the last item or the first item. You are going to get an arbitrary item. Actually, I think it does return the first item always, but each time you run your program, the set itself changes the item order. So you cannot depend on that in any way whatsoever. Let's try to loop our set. For item in set print item. Let's run our code and see what happens. Clear. And we run our code and it says Lisa, Mary, James, Karen, Richard, and Mark. Notice that it looped them. At this point, the list looks like that, and it looped them and printed them in that order. Let's do that again. And notice that the order is also different. So a set is an unordered list of, or let's say unordered collection of unique items. The items have to be distinct from each other. You can ask Python, what's the length of your list? And Python will return the length of your list. It says here 6, and Python return that. We will see these in much more details in the future. In the next episode, we will talk about multidimensional dictionaries and lists. Meanwhile, create some sets, create some tuples, and try to interact with them just to get used to them and how they differ from lists and dictionaries, because that's a very important difference. When you look at something, you need to know, is that a list, is that a tuple, is that a dictionary, is that a set? That's very important because you see them all the time. If you like this video, support the channel by subscribing. Until next time, enjoy.